At the first light of dawn in a small European valley, circa 1353, an eerie silence blankets the land. The Black Death, the Great Plague of 1347 to 1351, has finally loosened its grip. A gentle mist clings to fallow fields where no footsteps tread. Once, these fields were alive with peasants, sowing and reaping. Now they lie quiet, some sprouting only wildflowers. In the village, a rooster crows, but there are few to hear it. Half the cottages stand empty, their doors ajar, and thatch roofs sagging. Only a handful of survivors stir awake, rising from rough straw bedding to face another day in a world transformed by loss. In the span of just a few years, between one-third and one-half of Europe's people perished. In some unlucky towns, the death toll climbed even higher, two-thirds or more. The village priest, a weary young man who replaced three predecessors in quick succession, rings the church bell for morning prayers. Its chime echoes over the quiet fields, as if mourning those who can no longer come. This is the dawn of a new era, the world after the Black Death, where everyday life has been irrevocably altered. In this hushed, post-plague morning, we see nature quietly reclaiming what was once busy human space. Deer venture closer to homesteads. Birds roost in abandoned barns. On the edge of the village, creeping vines and weeds overtake what had been a well-tended vegetable garden. A broken plow rests where it was last used. Perhaps the plowman fell ill and never returned. In many places across Europe, entire villages were deserted. Chroniclers note that more than 1,300 English villages were abandoned in the decades after the plague. Forests grew back on empty farmlands, reversing centuries of clearing. It is said that in some regions, wolves roamed freely, even approaching Paris's outskirts, drawn by the silence and the scent of decay. The absence of human voices is striking. Where once children laughed and merchants haggled, now the loudest sound is the rustling of leaves or the distant cry of a hawk. The plague's immediate fury has passed, but its aftermath is everywhere, in the vacant homes, the untilled fields, and the haunted eyes of the survivors who remain. The survivors themselves move carefully through this new landscape. An elderly farmer, with joints aching, goes out to check his meager herd of goats. He whispers a prayer of thanks that he lived to see the sun rise, mindful that so many of his family and neighbors did not. Entire families were wiped out. It is not uncommon to find fresh graves containing a father, mother, and children together. Indeed, one Italian man, Agnolo di Tura of Siena, wrote with tragic resignation, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands." Such personal horrors were multiplied thousands of times across Europe. Now, in the clear morning air, those left behind carry the trauma with them. They tend to speak in hushed tones, if at all, as though loud joy has become inappropriate. There is a newfound gravity in daily life, a sense that the world teetered on the edge of apocalypse and only narrowly avoided the end. All believed it was the end of the world, wrote one observer of those plague years. After such catastrophe, every simple chore, milking a goat, baking bread, sweeping a floor, feels like defiance, a quiet victory of life over death. Yet as the days pass, life does continue. In this village and countless others, survivors slowly regroup. Neighbors who scarcely spoke before now rely on each other for basic tasks, sharing tools and labor since skilled hands are few. A widow checks on an orphaned child next door, bringing a portion of her meager porridge so the little one will not starve. A blacksmith with trembling hands, all his apprentices died, attempts to shoe a horse alone, adapting as best he can. Society has been shaken to its core, but humans are adaptable. Over the coming years, these remnant communities will reorganize and rebuild, albeit on new terms. The Black Death was a rupture, a great historical turning point that ended the old world and ushered in profound changes. In the calm of this plague-scarred dawn, the seeds of those changes are taking root, even if the people cannot yet see them. The story of what happens after the Black Death is beginning, quietly, in villages like this one. Before we explore the broader transformations, it's important to grasp the scale of devastation that preceded them. From 1347 to 1351, bubonic plague rampaged across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, killing tens of millions. Europe may have lost close to half its population in that first wave. Great cities like Florence saw their inhabitants fall from 120,000 to perhaps 50,000. Entire districts of London or Paris were left empty and overgrown. In the countryside, the plague often struck more slowly, but no less surely. Villages buried their dead in mass graves, like the famous scene recorded at Tournai, Belgium, where townsfolk carried coffins to a giant pit, 15 at a time, as depicted in a 14th century miniature. A chronicler in England remarked that mortality destroyed more than a third of the men, women, and children. Such a shortage of workers ensued that the humble turned up their noses at employment and could scarcely be persuaded to serve the eminent unless for triple wages. This vivid account, written around 1350 in Rochester, England, conveys not only the massive death toll, but also hints at the social upheaval already in motion. With so many gone, the survivors suddenly found their labor in high demand. It's crucial to note that the Black Death did not vanish overnight in 1351. The initial, most lethal wave subsided, but the plague returned in waves, or aftershocks, throughout the late 14th century. Many regions suffered outbreaks in 1361, often called the Little Mortality, 1369, 1374, and so on. Fortunately, these later epidemics were usually less deadly than the first cataclysm, perhaps claiming 10 to 20% of a local population instead of one-third or one-half. Even so, the repeated visitations of plague meant that Europe's population continued to stagnate or decline for decades. In fact, population levels in many areas kept falling until around 1400 or 1420. Only after circa 1450 did sustained growth really resume. This long demographic trough amplified the changes in society. It wasn't a quick rebound, but a slow, uneven recovery. Our village at dawn in 1353 is just at the beginning of a long period of adjustment. Over the next century, the people of Europe will experience remarkable shifts in economics, social structure, religion, and culture, all shaped by the profound reduction in their numbers. In the calm morning light, these changes are imperceptible, but soon they will become evident in every corner of daily life. Before the Black Death, the medieval world had its familiar rhythms and hierarchies. Now, in the wake of plague, traditional norms are upended. In the following parts, we will walk through these emerging changes as if we are observing them firsthand, in fields and manor houses, in market towns and churches, in art studios and ports. We will see lords and peasants bargaining over wages, common folk rising in rebellion, priests and monks grappling with their shaken faith, and artists painting dances of skeletons. All of this will be conveyed in the same gentle, measured tone with which we began, a calm storytelling of history, as one might speak late in the evening by the hearth, reflecting on how calamity transformed the world. The Black Death was a night of darkness. Now we explore the dawn that followed. Part 2. The Peasants' Worlds Turned Upside Down. It is mid-morning on an English manor in the 1350s, a few years after the plague. The sun has climbed, burning away the earlier mist, and now shines upon a gathering in front of the manor house. Here, beneath an ancient oak, a small group of peasants, the survivors of the village, stand nervously before the lord of the manor. The lord, clad in a threadbare velvet tunic, the luxury of old days now looking a bit worn, holds a parchment in his hand. On it is written the Statute of Laborers of 1351, a law passed by the King's Council, which decrees that no peasant shall demand higher wages than they received before the plague. The Lord's voice trembles slightly as he reads out the decree. He is unaccustomed to being defied, but these days even a lord must tread carefully. Facing him are the plowmen, reapers, and herdsmen who remain on his land, perhaps only a third of their former number. They exchange glances and murmur. Before, they would have bowed their heads and obeyed, without question, but now something is different. One of them, a middle-aged plowman hardened by years of labor and recent sorrow, he lost his wife to the plague, steps forward. In a respectful but firm tone, he speaks up. "My lord, we cannot feed our families on the old wages. There are too few of us to till all these fields. If you want the harvest in, you must offer better terms." His fellow villagers nod in solidarity. The lord flushes with anger and fear. He knows the man is right. Last year, much of the crop rotted because there weren't enough hands to gather it. The shortage of workers after the plague has made labor dear. Refusing their demand could mean ruin for them all, even himself. Scenes like this are unfolding all over Western Europe in the plague's aftermath. Serfs and peasants, long bound by feudal obligations, suddenly have leverage they never imagined. The traditional medieval social order, where lords held power and peasants had little choice, is turned upside down by sheer demographics. There are simply far fewer laborers available. Those who survived find that their work is urgently needed to rebuild agriculture and communities. As a result, wages naturally rise. Evidence from England shows laborers earning much more in the 1350s and 1360s than in the 1340s. One analysis indicates that in England, wages rose by roughly 22 and 40% in the decades after the Black Death. The Rochester Chronicle famously claimed some workers demanded triple wages compared to before. Landowners and authorities, however, did not accept these changes lightly. They fought back with laws and regulations. The Ordinance of Laborers, 1349, and the Statute of Laborers, 1351, in England were explicit attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' freedom to move. According to these edicts, any able-bodied person under a certain age had to work for whatever wages prevailed before the plague, and could not leave one employer to seek better pay elsewhere. Similar measures were enacted in France, some Italian cities, thus and elsewhere in Europe. In essence, the rulers and nobility tried to hold back the tide of change with legal shackles. On our English manor, we see how such measures played out in reality. The Lord, after hearing the peasant's plea, glances again at the parchment law. He knows that defying the king's statute could technically bring him trouble, yet if he hews to the law and refuses higher pay, his fields will remain empty. He recalls that last Michaelmas, none of the usual reapers from nearby villages came. They had all found work on estates offering better terms. Indeed, many peasants simply walked away from their old manors in search of higher wages elsewhere. Historical court records tell of laborers leaving without permission to earn more in the next county. Employers who tried to stop them sometimes had them captured and fined as the law allowed. But enforcement was spotty and often futile. The statute of laborers was poorly enforced in many areas. In England, farm wages doubled between 1350 and 1450, so despite the law. Knowing this, our Lord sighs and folds the parchment. With a forced smile, he offers a compromise, somewhat higher wages, if not triple, perhaps some freedom to glean extra grain from the fields, and permission for the peasants' children to gather wood in the Lord's forest. An old privilege often denied, the villagers agree. They too are bargaining carefully, aware that open defiance could bring punishment. An uneasy new balance is struck. The Lord keeps nominal authority, but he has ceded a great deal out of necessity. As they disperse to their tasks, one senses a shift in the air. The peasants walk a bit taller, the Lord a bit more humbled. This vignette illustrates a larger trend, the decline of serfdom and the weakening of feudal bonds in Western Europe after the Black Death. Even before the plague, serfdom, the system that bound peasants to their lord's land, had been slowly decaying in some regions. The plague greatly accelerated that process. With labor scarce, many lords found it impractical to enforce old labor services. Instead, they began to offer better terms to keep tenants, lower rents, or converting forced labor dues into fixed rents, so-called copyhold tenure. By 1500, in much of England, France, and Western Germany, serfdom was effectively gone or greatly diminished. A contemporary observer might note with amazement that younger peasants and even women were able to inherit land or take on roles once denied to them. Indeed, there was a change in inheritance customs. Whereas before, usually only the eldest son inherited, after the plague often all children, sons and daughters, could inherit property to ensure family lands didn't fall idle. If a noble family died out, their lands might pass to distant relatives or be broken up. Many widows, having lost husbands and grown sons, suddenly managed farms or shops on their own, gaining a measure of economic independence. Social mobility increased. A humble swineherd who survived might find himself taking over his late master's flock, or a peasant's son might marry into a landowning family that had lost heirs. The strict hierarchies of the medieval village were cracking. Not all regions saw these exact outcomes. In a striking contrast, while Western Europe's peasants were slowly gaining freedom, Eastern Europe's remaining peasants were bound more tightly than before. In places like Poland, Hungary, and later Russia, landlords took advantage of smaller populations by reinforcing serfdom, ensuring the peasants couldn't leave and had to provide cheap grain for export. This divergence, liberation in the West, second serfdom in the East, would shape European history for centuries. But in our current focus, the heart of Western Europe is experiencing a revolutionary easing of feudal restraints. Chronicles of the time remark on formerly destitute folk now wearing better clothes and eating better food. One English chronicler marveled, perhaps disapprovingly, that after the plague, the common people who were once satisfied with coarse bread now demanded the fine wheat bread that only lords ate before, as paraphrased from various accounts. This alarmed the nobles. They responded with not only wage controls, but also sumptuary laws, rules dictating what people of each class could wear or spend, aiming to keep peasants in their place despite their newfound wealth. For instance, England and some Italian cities banned lower class people from wearing furs or certain fabrics. Such laws were a futile attempt to freeze social distinctions at a time when those distinctions were blurring. Let us stroll now to a nearby market town to see another facet of the changed peasant world. It is market day, and a modest crowd has gathered in the town square. This town, too, bears plague scars. A boarded up shop here, a half-empty guild hall there. But those present are bustling with activity. Farmers have brought their grain, cheese, and livestock to sell. To their surprise, prices for agricultural goods are somewhat lower than before. With fewer mouths to feed, there is more food per person, and grain is not as dear as it once was. Meat and dairy, in particular, have become more common in the peasant diet. We see in the market plenty of butter, cheese, and even some cuts of beef, items that a poor family in 1340 might seldom afford, but in 1360 are more accessible. This is because many farms switched from labor-intensive grain farming to pasturing animals after the plague. Sheep, cattle, and pigs require fewer workers per acre than wheat or barley fields. With so much land untended, converting fields to grazing land made sense. The result? More wool, more leather, more meat on the market. So while wages rose, some basic goods prices stabilized or even fell, meaning survivors could enjoy a better standard of living in material terms. A contemporary cleric noted with surprise that even laborers were dining on meat and fine bread at times, rather than the peasants' traditional pottage and rye. This improvement in diet likely boosted health for a generation, ironic after a plague, but a clear example of how fewer people meant resources, like food and land, were more abundant per capita. Walking through the market, we hear snatches of conversation that reveal shifting attitudes. A young man boasts that he is leaving next week to a distant town where a master smith is paying a hefty wage for skilled help, something that would have been unthinkable when everyone was tied to their birthplace. A group of women haggling over cloth discuss how their daughters might marry tradesmen in the town now, instead of staying on the farm, upward mobility that previously was rare. We pass the stall of a cobbler, shoemaker, who is hurriedly working on a pile of orders. He confides that he's been swamped with work ever since that other cobbler on the next street died of plague, leaving him with double customers. He's earning well, enough to consider sending his son to an abbey school for an education. Such a notion, the son of a mere artisan getting an education, reflects the new opportunities emerging. Not everyone, of course, benefits equally. Many of the very poorest did die and had no kin to inherit anything. Some widows and orphans fell into destitution or were taken in by the church. But overall, the gap between rich and poor narrowed somewhat in these years. Historian Walter Scheidel and others have described the Black Death as a great leveler of inequality. By reducing the wealth of landowners and increasing the bargaining power of workers, It made the distribution of income a bit more even. Inequality lessened, a trend confirmed by records of wages and rents. One chronicler in Florence even claimed that servants now demand to be treated like masters, surely an exaggeration born of elite frustration. However, not everything was positive for the working classes. There were winners and losers, and some effects were delayed. For instance, in England, while nominal wages, the number of coins paid, went up, inflation in the later 1300s ate into those gains. The sudden influx of wealth to survivors, through inheritance, etc., and disruptions in trade led to rising prices for certain goods by the 1370s. A laborer might earn more pennies per day, but find that bread and tools cost more too, offsetting his higher income. So real wages, what one can actually buy with earnings, didn't immediately skyrocket. They improved modestly and only decisively rose after a couple of generations. This could cause frustration when expectations were not met. In addition, the elite's attempts to enforce laws created resentment. Those wage ceilings and movement restrictions effectively made it illegal for a peasant to fully take advantage of the tight labor market. Many did so anyway, but living under such laws was galling. Over time, the tension built up and would erupt violently, which brings us to the next part of our story: peasant revolts and social unrest that flared after the Black Death. Before we move on, let us take stock of what we've seen. The medieval working class found its voice. In the calm of a sunny market day, beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was taking place. Fields lay idle unless workers agreed to till them. Lords had to negotiate rather than simply command. The very social fabric of feudal society had begun to unravel, thread by thread, paving the way for a more modern relationship between those who own land and those who labor on it. Now we will witness what happened when these simmering changes burst into open conflict. Part 3: Upheaval and Rebellion. It is a warm June afternoon in 1381 on the road to London. The air is thick with dust as a great throng of people marches south. We find ourselves amid a peasant army, men and women of humble origin, armed with farm tools, staves, and a few swords. They are footsore and sunburnt, but their eyes burn with determination. At their head rides Wat Tyler, a charismatic figure who has emerged as a leader. Beside him is the fiery itinerant preacher, John Ball, whose oft-repeated cry, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" echoes through the ranks, a challenge to the idea of nobility by birth. This is the peasants' revolt in England, a dramatic climax to the tensions brewing since the Black Death. For decades, the common folk endured wage freezes and high taxes. Now they have risen to demand justice. As they near the city, the rebels' spirits are high. They have already overrun towns and destroyed hated records of serfdom. London's populace, too, is sympathetic. The city gates open to them. In an astonishing scene, thousands of country peasants pour into medieval London, swarming the streets, and even entering the Tower of London, where they seize and eventually execute the royal treasurer and the Archbishop of Canterbury, figures blamed for oppressive taxes. Though this revolt will soon be quelled, with Wat Tyler killed in a confrontation with King Richard II and harsh retribution visited on rebels. For a brief moment, the voice of the voiceless shakes the kingdom. What led to this extraordinary insurrection? The roots of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 trace directly back to the post-Black Death world. After the plague, as we saw, peasants gained leverage and some improvements, but the Statute of Laborers, 1351, and similar measures greatly angered them. Imagine working hard to rebuild your life after surviving the plague, only to have the law forbid you from earning the higher wages an employer is willing to pay. Resentment simmered for 30 years. Peasants grumbled in alehouses and around hearthfires about the injustice of frozen wages and the old feudal dues that some lords still tried to enforce. Meanwhile, the government, strapped for cash due to ongoing wars, like the 100 Years' War against France, imposed poll taxes that fell heavily on the poor. In 1381, a new poll tax was the final straw. A poll tax charges every individual the same amount, regardless of income, which meant a crushing burden on struggling villagers. Already chafing under decades of constraints, villages across southern England exploded in anger. Starting in Essex and Kent, bands of commoners chased away tax collectors and vowed to march to the king to air their grievances. One of their core demands was the abolition of serfdom and the freedom to work for fair wages. The chronicles of the time, even those written by elites, acknowledged the peasants' complaints. High taxes, low wages, and the long-term abuses of power by local landlords. In essence, the peasantry felt that the promises of the post-plague world had been denied to them by an oppressive law and tax regime. They wanted the new normal of better pay and personal freedom to be recognized as their right. The peasants' revolt, though ultimately suppressed, was a shock to the social order. King Richard II, only 14 years old at the time, met the rebels at Mile End and at Smithfield. In a famous episode, as tensions rose at Smithfield, Wat Tyler was struck down and killed by the Lord Mayor of London. The young king diffused the immediate crisis by promising reforms. He told the rebels, "You shall have, by my grace, whatever you seek, including the abolition of serfdom." The crowds dispersed and went home on the strength of these promises. Of course, once the army regrouped, Richard reneged on most of the concessions. The charters of freedom were revoked, and many rebel leaders were hunted and executed. Yet despite this harsh aftermath, the revolt left a lasting legacy. The ruling class was deeply unnerved by the unity and power the lower classes had shown. The slogan attributed to John Ball, "Now is the time, once lost, never again found. Let us cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty," continued to ring in the ears of lords. Over the next century, serfdom in England eroded further and was largely extinct by 1450 to 1500. Some historians argue that the revolt itself, though crushed, hastened the end of villanage, serfdom, by showing how untenable enforced labor had become. It is telling that within a generation of 1381, many remaining serfs were quietly converted into rent-paying tenants. The elites learned lessons too. They never again tried a poll tax of that kind until centuries later. While not an immediate triumph, the peasants' revolt symbolized the beginning of the end of the old feudal order in England. England's revolt was not unique. Across Europe, waves of rebellion and unrest swept through in the wake of the plague. In 1358, in France, barely a decade after the Black Death, peasants in the region of Beauvais and beyond rose up in a bloody uprising known as the Jacquerie. Enraged by nobles' harsh treatment and war-driven chaos, the Hundred Years' War was raging. These French peasants vented their fury by attacking manor houses and killing nobles. Chroniclers describe a brief, terrifying social reversal where the underclass took revenge on their betters, burning castles and even torturing aristocrats. The Jacquerie was crushed within weeks by a concerted response from knights and the royal army. Thousands of peasants were massacred in retribution, but like the English revolt later, it left a specter of fear in the noble imagination. The context of the Jacquerie was war and a leadership crisis. King John II had been captured by the English, yet underlying it was the post-plague reality. Fewer peasants, heavier demands. Indeed, the Jacquerie occurred in the wake of the Black Death and amid nobles trying to reassert control. Likewise, in the cities, the turmoil was evident. 1378 saw the Ciompi revolt in Florence, where wool carters and lower guild workers took over the city for a short time, demanding a voice in government and relief from poverty. Their revolt was also put down, but it highlighted the pressures on urban economies after the plague. Guild structures were strained as skilled workers died and survivors clamored for better conditions. Even where full-scale rebellions did not erupt, everyday resistance and negotiations continued. We might imagine, in a German principality or an Italian duchy, countless small incidents, villagers banding together to refuse an illegal tax, townsfolk petitioning for debt relief because so many died, or soldiers mutinying over unpaid wages. Monarchs had fewer taxpayers and often faced fiscal ruin. Lawless bands of mercenaries roamed the countryside in some regions, the Grandes Compagnies in France, for instance, as the disruption of war plus plague left many soldiers unpaid and turning to banditry. These mercenaries sometimes allied with peasant rebels or were hired to suppress them, adding to instability. The late 14th century world was, in short, a volatile one, a world trying to reassemble itself from the fragments left by the Black Death. Yet amid the unrest, there were also efforts to restore order and find new equilibrium. The ruling classes learned to adapt. They made some concessions, like lowering feudal rents or granting limited freedoms to avert further rebellions. A savvy lord in 1400 might willingly commute the last labor services of his tenants into a cash rent, effectively freeing them, because he calculated that a content peasantry was preferable to sparks of revolt. Kings and princes also made reforms. For example, some realms standardized taxes more fairly, not necessarily generously, but to avoid arbitrary impositions that provoked anger. The notion of bargaining in governance took hold. Parliaments and estates general were more often consulted on extraordinary taxes after seeing what could happen if common folk felt unheard. In England, King Richard's government, post-revolt, temporarily eased up on poll taxes and even issued general pardons, apart from key ringleaders, to pacify the realm. Though he reneged on specific promises, the broad lesson was that oppression had limits. Over the next century, peasant-free status and wage labor became the norm in much of Western Europe, vindicating in slow motion what rebels like Wat Tyler had demanded in 1381. Thus, the aftermath of the Black Death saw not only suffering, but also social progress forged in fire. The calm historical eye, looking back, notes that many reforms, or changes that would have been radical in 1340, became reality by 1450. The common people's quality of life improved. In many areas, they had more land per family, better bargaining power, and a larger share of the economic pie. They ate better, dressed a bit finer, despite laws against it, and some even challenged the idea that nobles were intrinsically superior. The old feudal lords remained, but they often transformed into something more like landlords in a market economy rather than masters of bonded serfs. A French chronicler in 1390 might have observed with astonishment that peasants in some villages will not carry out their corvées, labor duties, unless they are paid. This was the new reality, free or semi-free labor expecting wages. Naturally, these changes did not occur smoothly or uniformly. They were messy, contested, and sometimes violent, as we saw. But by the end of the 14th century, one could sense that medieval society had entered its twilight, making way for early modern patterns of social relations. As we leave the scene of rebellion and travel onward, the dust settles and calmer days return. Picture now an English countryside around 1400. The memory of 1381's revolt still lingers in the older folks who recount it by the fireside at night, but the fields are peaceful. Tenants plow their strips of land, knowing they'll owe only rent, not arbitrary labor, to the Lord. A local squire rides by and doffs his hat to a group of villagers, a small gesture of respect that perhaps was less common before. Life has resumed a steady rhythm, yet it is not the same tune as before the plague. The next parts of our journey will explore other realms of change, in faith, in knowledge, in arts. But as we do, remember this backdrop, a society where the downtrodden found a measure of relief and the mighty had to bow, if only slightly, to the shared experience of catastrophe. The peasant's world was upended, but from the chaos arose a more balanced order, one that would set the stage for the coming Renaissance and the modern age beyond. Part 4. Faith and the Church in the Wake of Plague. In a modest stone church atop a hill, circa 1355, a handful of villagers gather for Mass. Sunlight filters through the dusty air, illuminating empty pews where worshippers once crowded. The churchyard outside is tragically overfilled with fresh graves. Crude wooden crosses mark many, for the survivors lacked the resources for carved tombstones. The priest, a gaunt man in his 30s, leads the service with a shaky voice. He was only recently ordained, pressed into service young because so many clergy perished during the Black Death. In the front row sits a lone, elderly monk, the last of a nearby monastery that lost nearly all its brethren. As the congregation prays, their words carry a weight of desperation and hope. Faith has been both shaken and deepened by the calamity. Some here question why God allowed such suffering. Others cling ever more tightly to religion as the only solace in a capricious world. The Catholic Church, the central institution of medieval spiritual life, was profoundly affected by the plague. To understand the mood in this little church, consider the toll on the clergy. An estimated 40 to 50% of priests, monks, and nuns died during the Black Death. They had been on the front lines, administering last rites to the sick, tending the dying, acts of courage and compassion that often cost them their lives. In some villages, every priest died, leaving flocks with no shepherd. This led to an acute shortage of clergy. To fill the void, the church had to relax some requirements for ordination. Many young men with minimal training or education were hastily ordained as priests in the 1350s and 1360s. Some were barely literate, others had dubious moral character that normally would have barred them from clergy. The laity noticed this decline in clerical quality. Parishioners might encounter priests who could not adequately perform the Latin liturgy or who behaved in worldly ways. This harmed the church's reputation in the long run. Osenki a commons person might grumble, "Before the plague, our priest was a learned and holy man. Now we have a drunkard who can hardly read the gospel." While many new priests were doubtless sincere and doing their best, the sudden influx of underprepared clergy eroded the aura of the medieval church's sanctity. Furthermore, the church had failed to protect people from the plague. Despite processions, prayers, and masses imploring divine mercy, the plague struck down the pious and impious alike. This shook the faith of some. How could it be that no amount of prayer stopped the onslaught? Some survivors felt a subtle disillusionment, not necessarily abandoning belief, but perhaps viewing the church's earthly representatives with more skepticism. An English chronicle noted that after the plague, people esteemed the authority of the church less, believing that it too had failed, an anecdotal sentiment reported by later historians. At the same time, others responded with heightened piety. In the face of inexplicable tragedy, many turned fervently to God, seeing the plague as a punishment for sin or a test of faith. Religious fervor and fanaticism surged in various forms. One dramatic manifestation was the flagellant movement. Even during the plague years of 1348-49, bands of penitents roamed Europe, whipping themselves in public displays of repentance. They believed that by punishing their own flesh, they could atone for humanity's sins and avert God's wrath. Though the church hierarchy disapproved, Pope Clement VI condemned flagellants as heretical. Their popularity showed how desperate people were for spiritual reassurance. In the aftermath, such movements left their mark, a lingering notion among common folk that formal church rituals might not suffice, and extreme personal penance might be needed to appease God. The plague also fueled scapegoating and persecutions driven by religious zeal. As fear ran rampant, some accused marginalized groups of causing the plague through witchcraft or poison. Jewish communities, in particular, faced horrific pogroms. Even as early as 1349, while plague still raged, Christians in cities like Strasbourg and Mainz massacred Jews, blaming them for poisoning wells. These violence were often encouraged by local zealots and not effectively stopped by the church. Indeed, some clergy participated in the conspiracy theories, though Pope Clement VI tried to quell them, issuing bulls declaring Jews innocent of plague-bringing. After the plague ended, the Jewish population of many regions was decimated not just by disease, but by murder. In the decades after, surviving Jewish communities sometimes relocated to more tolerant areas like Poland, or lived in deeper secrecy. This dark episode shows how social trust had frayed, a byproduct of the trauma that did not reflect well on Christendom's moral state. Inside the church itself, the plague may have indirectly spurred calls for reform and introspection. Devout thinkers asked, was the plague a judgment on a corrupt society, including a corrupt church? There was a sense that the moral failings of humanity, greed, lechery, false piety, had incurred divine punishment. We find in writings of the later 14th century more emphasis on personal morality and less blind trust in institutions. For example, in England, a theologian named John Wycliffe in the 1370s began sharply criticizing church wealth and the worldliness of clerics. While Wycliffe's movement, the Lollards, had many roots, one could argue that the post-plague climate made people receptive to his ideas. They had seen unworthy priests and unanswered prayers. Wycliffe's call to return to Scripture and a simple poor church rang true to some. The Lollards were suppressed, but their ideology foreshadowed the Protestant Reformation in the next century. Similarly, in Bohemia, the preacher John Hus, early 1400s, demanded reforms and spoke against indulgences. He gained a following, and after being executed as a heretic in 1415, inspired the Hussite rebellion. It's telling that these early reformers emerged not long after the Black Death, at a time when respect for the Church's authority had been subtly undermined by events. Yet it would be wrong to say the Church collapsed after the plague. Far from it. In many ways, the Church showed resilience. People still flocked to churches for comfort, and the rituals of baptism, marriage, and funeral masses remained central to community life. If anything, the plague increased the Church's workload. Masses for the dead, memorial services, and the establishment of chantries, endowments to say prayers for souls, multiplied. The Church also took practical steps. New charitable institutions were founded to care for orphans and the poor left behind. Some monasteries, ravaged by plague, merged with others to survive. Others recruited new monks from different social backgrounds to replenish numbers. The papacy, which at the time of the Black Death was seated in Avignon, continued its administrative functions. Interestingly, right after the worst plague years, the Church dealt with another internal crisis, the Papal Schism, 1378 to 1417, when two, eventually three rival popes claimed leadership. This schism was not directly caused by the plague, but the general turmoil of the era likely made it harder for the Church to present a united, unassailable front. The schism further eroded the image of the Church, as people saw churchmen wrangling for power while Europe was still recovering from disaster. It was resolved in 1417 at the Council of Constance, restoring one pope in Rome, but the damage to papal prestige lingered. Back in our hilltop church, the Mass concludes. The priest gives a short sermon. His theme is familiar in post-plague times. Life is fragile, and death can come swiftly, a lesson none needed reminding of. He urges his flock to be prepared in soul, to live uprightly, for you know not the day nor the hour. This emphasis on the transience of life and the nearness of death was pervasive after the Black Death. It shows up in art and literature, as we will see in the next part, but also in everyday religious practice. The concept of memento mori, remembering that you must die, took on new immediacy. People were drawn to confraternities or lay religious groups that engaged in acts of penitence and charity. Pilgrimages to saints' shrines increased in some areas, as survivors gave thanks for their deliverance or sought continued protection. The cult of certain saints gained popularity. Saint Roch, yield Saint Rachus, who was said to have miraculously healed plague victims, became widely venerated by the late 14th century. Saint Sebastian, traditionally invoked against plague, due to surviving being shot by arrows, seen as analogous to plague arrows of God's wrath, also became a focus of devotion. Churches and cities started erecting altars or statues dedicated to these plague saints, seeking their intercession should the Black Death return. One also notices changes in burial practices and memorials. Before the plague, only the wealthy had elaborate tombs, but afterwards there emerged a fashion for macabre yet pious tomb art, even among elites. So-called transi tombs began to appear. These were sculptures that showed the deceased not in idealized form, but as a decaying corpse or skeleton, sometimes under their effigy. The message was stark. Death comes for all, be you king or commoner, and earthly glory is fleeting. Such imagery, endorsed by the Church as a moral lesson, clearly reflects the plague's imprint on the collective psyche. In simpler village settings, churchyard murals or wood carvings might depict the dance of death, danse macabre, skeletons leading people of every social rank in a procession. We will discuss this art soon, but it's worth noting that these were often painted on church walls or carved on churchyard ossuaries, blending art with spiritual teaching. Despite the trauma and critiques, the fundamental religious faith of the populace by and large endured. The idea of a just and omnipotent God was not abandoned. Rather, interpretations shifted. Some preachers framed the Black Death as the fiery trial that would ultimately renew Christian society, comparing it to the Great Flood or other biblical scourges that led to a fresh start. And indeed, some positive reforms within the church did happen. For example, seeing the huge mortality, the church intensified efforts to ensure the education of clergy. New colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, like New College, Oxford, founded 1379, and Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, founded 1352, were established in part to train clergy and pray for plague victims' souls. These foundations suggest an organized response to spiritual needs, education, and commemoration as remedies for loss. Theological thought also quietly evolved. There was more interest in explanations for mass suffering. Some theologians pondered if perhaps God allowed the plague to spur humans to more fervent repentance and humility. Others looked for natural explanations permissible within faith, noting that human sin, like greed leading to poor care for the poor, etc., had worsened the disaster. Let's imagine a final scene to capture the spiritual atmosphere. A few years after the first outbreak, perhaps in 1355, a large procession winds through a city, say Venice or Cologne. Leading it is the local bishop, barefoot and carrying a relic of a saint. Behind him, clergy and lay people follow in orderly rows, singing litanies. They carry candles and banners painted with images of Christ or the Virgin Mary. On one banner is sewn an image of Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows, imploring his aid against plague. At intervals, the procession stops, and everyone kneels as prayers are chanted for the souls of those who died and for protection from future pestilence. These penitential processions became common whenever a new plague outbreak threatened. The mood is solemn yet hopeful. The community, having suffered together, now prays together for deliverance. Such collective acts helped restore a sense of communal solidarity and reassurance that God's grace might yet prevail. In summary, after the Black Death, religion remained a cornerstone of life, but under strain and undergoing change. The church, as an institution, faced criticism and adapted by necessity. Ordinary people maintained faith, but often in a more personal, penitential way, deeply marked by awareness of mortality. We see an interesting duality. On one hand, a disillusionment with some clergy and church excesses that would eventually feed into calls for reform. On the other hand, a renewed spirituality that was in many cases more heartfelt and urgent than before, since death had never felt so close. The calming rituals of the church, the Mass, the sacraments, continued to provide structure and meaning, even as the content and context of faith subtly evolved. As we leave the realm of faith, keep in mind that this was an age where the sights of death were everywhere but were met with prayer, art, and reflection rather than despair alone. Part 5: Innovations in Health and Society. The Black Death's devastation forced medieval society not only to adjust socially and spiritually, but also to innovate in practical ways, particularly in health and governance. Imagine now the bustling port of Ragusa on the Adriatic Sea, modern Dubrovnik, in the late 14th century. A ship has just arrived from Venice, its sails furled. Normally, the crew and cargo would disembark immediately, merchants eager to trade their goods. But not this time. The authorities of Ragusa, recalling all too well how plague arrived on ships earlier in the century, have instituted a strict new policy. As of 1377, any ship coming from a region afflicted by plague must undergo isolation before landing. Thus, this vessel is directed to a small rocky island just off the coast, a designated isolation station. There, crew and passengers will spend a prescribed period, initially 30 days, later extended to 40 days, hence the term quarantine from 40 giorni, Italian for 40 days. Only after this time, if no one falls ill, will they be allowed into the city. The ship's captain grumbles but complies. He knows that other ports, like Venice and Genoa, are adopting similar measures. In fact, Ragusa's quarantine law of 1377 is one of history's first official quarantine edicts. It states that those coming from plague-affected places shall not enter the city unless they spend a month on the islet of Merkin or in the coastal town of Kavtat for disinfection. This extraordinary rule shows a budding understanding. Even without knowing about bacteria, medieval people realized that isolating newcomers could prevent disease spread. They observed that plague had an unseen incubation period, a concept reflected in Ragusa's regulation, which held travelers long enough to see if symptoms developed. This is a remarkable insight for the time and a milestone in public health. Elsewhere, other Italian cities took similar steps. Venice, which had been struck hard by plague, established a permanent pest house and quarantine station on an island in 1423. The Lazaretto Vecchio, essentially the first dedicated plague hospital. Suspected plague victims or arrivals were kept there under supervision. Over time, the Venetian government created a health office and protocols for handling outbreaks. These included travel restrictions, checkpoints on roads, fumigation of letters, and even early contact tracing, noting who had been in a house with the sick. These efforts, born out of necessity, represent a shift from viewing plague solely as divine punishment to treating it as a contagion that could be managed with earthly means. To be sure, medieval medicine still humbly lacked effective cures. They relied on theories of bad air, miasma, and astrological causes. But the plague taught them practical lessons. Fresh air and cleanliness seemed to help. Crowding made things worse. Some cities invested in better sanitation. For example, officials in Milan reportedly walled up plague-infected houses entirely in 1349, which was draconian but may have limited spread there. Later, cities would improve street cleaning and try to keep water sources clean, partly to avoid the accusation of well poisoning that caused violence. We see here the roots of modern public health emerging from the plague years. In the realm of medicine and science, the aftermath of the Black Death spurred a subtle but important transformation. The glaring failure of doctors to cure the plague. They tried bloodletting, poultices of herbs, carrying fragrant posies. None availed. Shook confidence in the old authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, whose ancient writings couldn't explain this horror. Some physicians began to question traditional dogma and sought new knowledge through observation and dissection. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a few European medical schools, such as those in Padua or Montpellier, started to emphasize anatomy more. One historian, David Herlihy, argued that after the Black Death there was increased attention to direct study of the human body, laying groundwork for Renaissance medicine. For instance, autopsies, which had been rare, became slightly more common, sometimes to figure out cause of death, sometimes out of morbid curiosity. While religious qualms still limited human dissection, the taboo was weakening. There was a sense that if such catastrophe could strike, perhaps more empirical understanding of nature was needed rather than blind reliance on ancient texts. Over the next century, this shift would contribute to breakthroughs. The work of anatomists like Andreas Vesalius in 1543 can trace intellectual roots back to this reevaluation in the plague's wake. Consider also technology and labor-saving inventions. As mentioned, with a scarcity of workers, there was incentive to mechanize or streamline work. Historians suggest that the post-plague period saw increased adoption of devices like water mills and windmills because fewer millers were available and communities needed to grind grain efficiently. Similarly, printing technology came to Europe in the mid-15th century, Gutenberg's press around 1450. While printing's development had many factors, one could speculate that a reduction in the scribal workforce and increased demand for books, since more people had some wealth and interest in reading, helped motivate this invention. Another example, gunpowder weapons. Europe had known gunpowder from the early 14th century, but its widespread use in warfare picks up in the late 1300s and 1400s. Partly this was due to ongoing wars, but one could argue that with populations smaller, rulers turned to new tech to gain advantages in battles. Cannons and handguns could make a smaller army more formidable. In daily life, smaller innovations mattered as well. There's a charming theory that the European practice of afternoon naps or shortened work days in harvest may have roots in post-plague labor negotiation, though people likely always took breaks in heat. More concretely, craftsman guilds, faced with the loss of many masters and apprentices, sometimes relaxed strict rules to allow newcomers or women to take up trades. For instance, in some cities, widows of artisans were permitted to continue their husband's business, baking, brewing, weaving, even if previously women were barred, simply because their labor was needed. This gave some women greater economic role. We might picture a scene in a Flemish town where a widow, after the plague, openly runs a loom workshop, hiring a few journeymen to help, and the guild welcomes her dues because they have empty memberships otherwise. The shock of the plague thus cracked open some gender and professional barriers, albeit temporarily. Many were reinforced later. Beyond material innovations, the plague also influenced institutions and governance. We've touched on public health boards. More broadly, many cities and states updated their legal codes to handle the unprecedented situations that arose. For example, inheritance law had to cope with cases where whole families died. Cities passed laws on how to manage property with no direct heirs, often giving more rights to surviving spouses or distant kin than before, to avoid land falling into limbo. In some cases, the state confiscated such estates, but often they encouraged repopulation by granting land to anyone willing to cultivate it. Colonization of empty land was actively promoted. Eastern Europe, relatively less affected, invited Western settlers to come farm their untilled fields. In Western Europe, internal migration was huge. People from overpopulated highlands moved to newly available fertile valleys. Rulers sometimes gave tax holidays to people who would resettle abandoned villages. This foreshadows the age of colonization. One might say Europe got practice in resettling land after the plague that later translated into colonizing new continents, though that was much later. The labor shortage also led to some legal recognition of laborers' rights in an indirect way. While the initial response was coercive, statute of laborers, by the 15th century, many regions accepted higher wages as the norm. City governments vied to attract workers by offering privileges. For example, some German cities granted town citizenship to rural folks who moved in, hoping to boost their population and economy. Landlords competed to entice farmers to their lands by offering better terms, sometimes multi-year leases with fixed rents, so the farmer wouldn't fear sudden eviction. This was the embryo of a more contractual society, where relationships are set by agreements and pay, not by birth status alone. Now, let's zoom in on one particularly poignant form of innovation, the care for the sick. While true medical cures were elusive, some did experiment with new treatments. There are records of doctors trying out different herbal concoctions, learning from Arabic medical texts, which were being translated more eagerly as Europeans realized their own medical knowledge needed augmenting. Hospitals, in the medieval sense, which were more like hospices or shelters for the ill and poor, adapted too. Some were overwhelmed during the plague and then rebuilt with better facilities for isolation. One might envision a scene in, say, 1400 at a hospital in Florence. The ward is less crowded than it was in 1348, but the brothers in charge have instituted a practice of separating patients with fevers into a different room, a rudimentary form of triage and isolation gleaned from bitter experience. They also burn aromatic woods or vinegar in the air, which, though not truly effective against Yersinia pestis, at least indicates an attempt at disinfection. The idea that foul airs carry disease led to attempts at cleaning the air. Interestingly, some scholars posit a genetic impact of the Black Death. The massive mortality might have increased the prevalence of certain genetic traits in European populations, potentially including a mutation, CCR5D32, that provides immunity to some diseases. While the details are debated, it raises a notion that even on a biological evolutionary level, the plague reshaped the populace. Survivors and their descendants might have had, on average, slightly different health profiles, perhaps more robust against particular infections. If true, that's an unintended innovation in humanity itself, courtesy of natural selection during the plague. In governance, the shortage of manpower also meant that governments restructured military and administrative systems. Mercenaries became more common, since feudal levies shrank. Some states centralized authority to better coordinate response to crises. For example, improving communication about plague outbreaks or standardizing responses. City-states like Venice created the health board, as mentioned, but also kept detailed records of deaths and causes, an early form of vital statistics tracking. We might find in Venetian archives from late 1300s registers of how many died each month, categorized by parish, a data-driven approach that was nascent but would grow in later centuries. A concrete effect in rural areas was the changing landscape, less cultivation in marginal areas, and more pastures meant that Europe's environment breathed a bit. Forests regrew, which had knock-on effects such as possibly improving flood control and soil quality. There was less erosion when uplands were reforested. Peasants hunting in those woods could catch more wild game. Deer populations likely rebounded when human pressure eased. A pastoral wooded countryside of the later 14th century, dotted with grazing sheep, looked different from the intensively cropped patchwork of 1300. This inadvertently may have helped agriculture in the long run by abandoning the least productive lands. Overall productivity per worker went up. It also contributed to Europe's distinctive wool industry growth. English wool, for instance, became a prized export by 1400, feeding cloth making in Flanders, in part because landowners turned tilled fields into sheepwalks. The wealth from wool trade later funded enterprises and even artistic patronage. One could argue that the commercial economy shifted with less focus on sheer grain production since population was down and more on high-quality goods for trade, wool, wine in some areas as vineyards replaced grain fields, etc. This added to the rise of a merchant class and the economic dynamism of the 15th century. We should also note how education and literacy fared. The immediate plague years were disastrous for schools and universities. Professors and students died or fled. But soon after, there was a drive to replenish educated ranks. University enrollments picked up by the 1380s. Colleges, as mentioned, were endowed to train more priests and civil servants. The 14th century saw universities founded in places like Prague, 1348, Krakow, 1364, Vienna, 1365, and others. Some impetus for these may have been to replace knowledge lost to plague. If we step into a university in 1400, we might see classes brimming with the sons of survivors who made good. A miller's son or a merchant's son could now afford education that perhaps would have been out of reach when social mobility was less. There's anecdotal evidence that student demographics broadened slightly because of shifts in wealth and population. With printing on the horizon, the dissemination of knowledge would soon accelerate. The calmer century after the Black Death laid groundwork for that. One last scene to illustrate innovation. The year is 1417 in Constance, a city in what is now Germany. Church and secular leaders from across Europe have gathered to resolve the Great Schism at the Council of Constance. This council not only ends the schism by electing a new sole pope, Martin Sergiv, but also enacts reforms influenced by the last 70 tumultuous years. Among these is a renewed emphasis on morality of clergy and some discipline in monastic orders, a partial answer to the issues flagged by the plague's aftermath. But more intriguingly, at the fringes of the council, scholars discuss new ideas. The first stirrings of Renaissance humanism are in the air. One delegate, Poggio Bracciolini, uses his downtime to search monastic libraries for lost classical texts. It's in the 1410s and 1420s that many ancient manuscripts are rediscovered, jump-starting the Renaissance. The coincidence of this intellectual revival with the post-plague period is noteworthy. Many factors led to the Renaissance, but one could argue that the wealth accumulation in fewer hands, a slightly more open society, and a hunger for answers beyond medieval scholasticism, all encouraged by the blacks' death's impact, made Europe ripe for a cultural rebirth. Poggio finds a copy of Lucretius's ancient poem on the nature of things in 1417, a text that celebrates reason and the atomistic view of the world. It's almost symbolic. Out of the despair of the plague, years emerges a recovered wisdom from antiquity, suggesting that the way forward may be found in new or old new knowledge. As this part comes to a close, consider how calm perseverance and necessity led medieval people to innovate. In the quiet of port offices, drafting quarantine rules, in the dusty libraries where scribes copied medical treatises with new annotations, in the workshops where artisans tweaked their tools, the Black Death's challenge sparked creativity. These innovations were not flashy or immediate rewards of the plague, but slow changes that gradually improved resilience. If one looks at the year 1500 and compares it to 1300, you see a Europe transformed. Population had rebounded somewhat, but with different social structures. Technology like printing and gunpowder were changing communication and warfare. Nation-states were starting to form identities, partly because they had to manage crises like plague collectively, and a spirit of inquiry was blooming that would lead to the voyages of discovery and scientific revolution down the line. The Black Death, grim as it was, can be seen as a catalyst that hastened the end of the medieval world and the dawn of something new. We have now painted how society adapted in practical terms. For the final part, let us turn our eyes to the cultural sphere, art, literature, and philosophy, to see how the immense trauma and subsequent renewal of the post-plague era imprinted itself on the creative soul of Europe. Part 6: Culture and Renaissance, a dance with death and life. In a dimly lit chapel in 1425, an artist stands on scaffolding, brush in hand. By flickering candlelight, he adds details to a striking mural on the wall. The painting is a danse macabre, the dance of death. Grinning skeletons cavort with people of all classes, a king in his crown, a bishop with his crozier, a merchant with his purse, a plowman with his spade. The skeletal figure of death leads them in a round dance towards an open grave. Despite the morbid theme, the artist paints with a calm, almost tender touch. Each living person's face is rendered with individuality and subtle emotion, surprise, sorrow, resignation, while the skeletons have a mocking exuberance. This imagery, which might seem ghastly, has become oddly popular in churches and cemeteries across Europe after the Black Death. It carries a clear message: death unites everyone, rich or poor, and one must be prepared. The chapel's priest requested this mural to remind his flock of life's fragility and the need for penitence. But on another level, the dance of death also represents a kind of coping mechanism, an artistic means to make sense of the senseless. By personifying death and even giving it a playful dance, people symbolically assert some familiarity, even control, over their fear. The cultural effects of the Black Death were profound. After 1350, European art, literature, and even architecture took on new tones. A mood of morbid reflection and realism pervaded creative works. The ubiquitous dance of death motif we just described first appeared around this time. One early example was painted in Paris's Cemetery of the Innocents in the late 1420s. Another common motif was the triumph of death, depicted as a skeletal figure on horseback cutting down people, like the fresco in Palermo around 1446, or later paintings by Pieter Bruegel. Yet another was the tale of the 3 living and 3 dead, a fable where 3 young nobles encounter 3 corpses who tell them, "As we are, so shall you be." This story, illustrating memento mori, was illustrated in manuscripts and wall paintings. These artistic themes show how society was processing the trauma. By bringing death into daily consciousness, perhaps it became less terrifying. The art was dark, yes, but also cathartic and instructive. Literature, too, bore the plague's imprint. Perhaps the most famous example is Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written just after 1348. In this collection of tales, a group of young men and women retreat to a country villa outside Florence to escape the plague, and to pass the time they tell stories. 100 stories of love, humor, tragedy, and wit. Boccaccio's introduction provides a vivid account of the Black Death in Florence, describing how neighbors abandoned each other, how the sick were left untended, how bodies piled up in churches. Consecrated churchyards did not suffice. Vast trenches were dug, and hundreds of bodies heaped therein. This frank description set the stage for his tales, which often emphasized life's capriciousness and human cleverness. The very premise and the storytelling as an antidote to despair is a cultural response to plague. Art, in this case narratives, used to affirm life and distract from horror. Boccaccio's work is generally considered an early dawn of Renaissance humanism. It's worldly, concerned with human behaviors and follies, even gently satirical of the church at times. One could argue that seeing the indiscriminate cruelty of the plague made writers like Boccaccio more focused on the human experience in the here and now, rather than purely spiritual matters. Similarly, the poet Petrarch, who lived through the plague, losing his beloved Laura to it, reportedly, wrote letters and poems that reflect deep melancholy and questioning. In one famous letter, Petrarch lamented that in his time, the lands are left desolate, and a terrible fear and emptiness beyond expression hath overtaken the world. But he also encourages future generations to learn from the trials of his age. Petrarch's introspection and emphasis on individual feelings contributed to the rise of Renaissance humanist thought, where personal expression and classical wisdom were prized. Indeed, Petrarch's generation, scarred by plague, turned to the literature of ancient Rome, Cicero, Seneca, etc., for moral guidance and solace, effectively kickstarting the Renaissance's adoration of classical antiquity. As art became more macabre in theme, it also became more realistic in style. Scholars note that after the plague, especially by the early 1400s, European art took strides in realism and emotional expression. Northern European painters like Jan van Eyck achieved startling levels of detail and lifelikeness. Some attribute this to a general shift in mindset, a world that has confronted raw reality, death, and decay might value unvarnished truth in art. The Italian artist Giotto had begun a trend towards realism before the plague, but after mid-century, his successors like Masaccio and others carried it further, adding perspective and volume to figures. In sculpture, we see extremely emotive works, the faces of mourners on tombs contorted with grief, holy figures depicted with palpable suffering. It's as if art could no longer be content with stylized, otherworldly representation. It had to grapple with the real pain and raw humanity people had witnessed. The Gothic style itself evolved. Late Gothic art, the so-called International Gothic, still had elegance but often included haunting imagery of death. Meanwhile, in Italy, a revival of classical motifs began, partly an effort to find beauty and order after chaos. As mentioned, some architects and sculptors looked back to Greco-Roman forms, columns, harmonious proportions, a foreshadow of the Renaissance style. Others in Northern Europe doubled down on Gothic, making it even more elaborate, as if to reach up to heaven, away from Earth's misery. One can also consider how music might have been influenced, though records are sparse. There is evidence of masses written for the dead and motets reflecting the turmoil. A famous song from the period Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, though its origins predate the plague, gained resonance as a sequence in requiem masses, evoking the Last Judgment, which many thought they had glimpsed during the plague. Despite the somber themes, out of this cultural ferment emerged the glimmers of optimism and rebirth. Literally, the Renaissance, which means rebirth. By the 1400s, especially in Italy, an energetic cultural revival was underway. Many of the early Renaissance luminaries had family histories touched by plague. For example, the grandfather of Leonardo da Vinci was born around 1400, growing up in a world drastically changed by plague. The patron family of the Medici in Florence rose in the generations after. The plague, 14th to 15th century, partially benefiting from new economic opportunities. These connections remind us that the Renaissance did not arise in a vacuum. It was in part a response to the conditions created by the plague. The people who lived after the Black Death had a different perspective, a blend of mourning and carpe diem, seize the day. Some historians suggest that survivors felt a new freedom to enjoy worldly life, since they had seen how short it could be. The Decameron's tales of wit and amorous adventures, or the slightly later Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, written in the 1380s, which mix moral lessons with hearty humor, both exemplify this worldlier outlook. Chaucer, in fact, worked as a bureaucrat and diplomat in post-plague England, and in his Canterbury Tales, he depicts a range of characters from that society: a plowman, a knight, a prioress, a miller, all traveling together telling stories. It's as if the rigid social barriers have relaxed enough that such a motley group can share a pilgrimage. While not explicitly about the plague, Chaucer's vibrant cross section of society reflects the more fluid social reality after the plague, and he does nod to the plague's effects at times. One of his characters in The Pardoner's Tale describes finding corpses from plague, for instance. From a famous printed world history, shows skeletons merrily leading men and women in a dance. Kings, popes, peasants, all hand in hand with death. Its style is bold and somewhat naive, but it was mass-produced in a printed book, meaning this imagery was widely seen by ordinary readers in the late 15th century. The popularity of such prints suggests that by then, the concept of the universality of death had become almost a cultural cliché, a common reference. It had penetrated folk culture. Some folk songs and plays about the dance of death were performed. But interestingly, by 1493, Europe was on the cusp of new globals, discoveries, and great changes. The danse macabre motif, while still potent, was gradually giving way to more life-affirming Renaissance themes. The beauty of the human body, the potential of man, the exploration of new worlds. In a way, the culture had worked through the trauma by confronting it head-on in art, and now was ready to move forward. The skeletons would recede into the background as the 1500s progressed. Though plagues would still recur, the outlook had shifted toward resilience and progress. One more cultural consequence. The Black Death arguably democratized art and religion to a small degree. Because death had cut down nobles and commons alike, artists and writers portrayed common people with more respect and interest than before. We see more peasant figures in art, often as allegories, but still visible. Literature like the Decameron and Canterbury Tales gives voice to varied social classes. Even in religious art, there's a new emphasis on Christ's humanity and suffering, the man of sorrows imagery, etc., which ordinary people identified with in their suffering. Some art historians link this to the plague's collective ordeal. Everyone felt like Job from the Bible, and thus depictions of Christ's passion with very human pain became more popular, making religion more personal and empathetic. To illustrate, so could consider a painting by Rogier van der Weyden around 1445, The Descent from the Cross. Mary, the mother of Jesus, has fainted in grief as Christ's body is lowered, her face ashen. The emotional realism is striking. One sees genuine despair and tears. It's said that van der Weyden, living a century after the plague, carried forward the tradition of intense emotion in art that likely stems from the collective memory of catastrophic loss. He and others made art that could evoke tears and spiritual catharsis, much as people must have wept in those plague years and then sought healing. Not all cultural response was grim. There was also a resurgence of celebration of life. Festivals and carnivals, after the worst passed, might have been particularly exuberant. There are indications that late medieval carnival traditions, like in Venice and southern Germany, grew more raucous, possibly because people knew how fragile life was. The dance of death could be seen not only as admonition, but as strangely comforting entertainment, something performed in carnival pageants. So while one side of culture was pious and death-focused, another side said, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." Some survivors engaged in what one chronicle called dissolute and frivolous enjoyment, interpreting that since the world might end, they might as well enjoy it. Boccaccio notes some in Florence adopted a lifestyle of total indulgence during the plague, and afterwards, that attitude may have lingered among a segment. This dual response, ascetic piety versus hedonistic revelry, often coexisted, and both found expression in culture. As our exploration draws to an end, imagine one final symbolic scene. In Florence around 1400, the city has erected a magnificent new public building, the foundling hospital called the Ospedale degli Innocenti, Hospital of the Innocents, designed by the architect Brunelleschi, who will later build the famous dome of Florence's cathedral. It isn't finished until 1420s, but the planning is underway by 1419. This foundling hospital is essentially an orphanage for children left without parents, an all too common situation after waves of plague. Its architecture is groundbreaking, serene classical arches, harmonious proportions, the first truly Renaissance building. The very act of building it is an expression of humanism and charity, values that bloomed in the aftermath of tragedy. It says, "We will care for the most vulnerable, the orphans, and we will do so in beautiful surroundings that reflect our revived faith in human potential and divine order." The connection may be subtle, but it's there. The plague taught the necessity of compassion, so many orphans to tend, and spurred the desire for a new aesthetic. Perhaps a beautiful, orderly building is a kind of exorcism of the ugliness of mass death. Standing in the loggia of this hospital, one can see inscriptions praising the citizens who funded it. Florentine merchants, enriched partly by post-plague economic shifts, spent their money on this public good. This philanthropic spirit, alongside artistic patronage, is a hallmark of the Renaissance city-states. It is a hopeful note on which to conclude. Out of the great mortality came not only sorrow, but a resolve to improve the world for the living, whether through better institutions, great art, or simply kinder relationships. As night falls, we leave the quiet streets of our imagined Renaissance city and reflect on the journey we've taken. The world after the Black Death was by no means a paradise. There were new conflicts, recurring plagues, and injustices aplenty, but it was a world that had been irrevocably changed and in many ways reshaped for the better. The laborer could command wage and respect unknown to his forebears. The devout soul sought a more personal connection to the divine. Cities learned to take measures to guard health, and artists and thinkers, having gazed into the abyss, produced works of lasting genius that affirmed life and human dignity. It's often said that the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance in the 14th and 15th centuries. Now we understand that the Black Death was a catalyst in that transformation. Like a forest fire that clears old growth, terrible and destructive, yet allowing new shoots to spring from the ash, the plague burned away an old order and left space for renewal. In our calm retelling, we have watched this renewal unfold in various forms. Now, as you drift to rest, perhaps listening in the quiet of night, you can ponder this resilience of humanity. History shows that even after the darkest of nights, morning comes, and with it, rebirth. The survivors of the Black Death rebuilt their world piece by piece, finding meaning in toil, in faith, in creativity. Their story is at once sobering and inspiring, and in its gentle telling, we find a kind of peace, knowing that from great calamity, humanity has again and again found the strength to endure, to adapt, and to tell new stories for the future.